But I'll just stop rambling in hopes that there's a question here, or if there isn't, Cynthia and I will ask.
I have a question. You had talked about, the press passes and who gets into a press conference, and we saw during the last election with a certain Norm Coleman campaign that some journalists were actually excluded because they weren't considered legitimate journalists. And I've been asked questions from students as a blogger, who is a journalist? What defines who is a legitimate journalist and who isn't, especially when you have a proliferation of bloggers who, as you said, can just open up a site and start blogging and show their ID and say, I'm a journalist. What defines journalism, in your view?
All right, I'm going to take that one first. Well, I'm fairly obsessed with the Constitution, and I can tell you that the First Amendment does not make a distinction between professional journalists, amateur journalists, and regular citizens. Everybody's freedom under the First Amendment is the same. There are situations, and we've already alluded to them, where, let's say, space is limited and it is necessary to make those choices. But as a general answer to your question, I don't think there is a working definition of where the line is. I think that the huge changes in journalism over the last few years have made it even harder. Because really, it wasn't that long ago where a journalist was someone who either worked for a newspaper, a radio station, or a TV station, and they could prove it, and that was about it. And now the lines are very blurred. One of the sites, Jay can back me up on this from the audience, but one of the sites that was having trouble getting into some of those Norm Coleman events was the Uptake. And the Uptake is a site that basically we just wanted to broadcast the events on the internet. But I believe they were perceived as unfriendly by the Coleman campaign, and so they weren't letting them come in with their cameras. And of course, another thing about the internet age is we then had footage on the internet of the Uptake reporter with his own camera being hustled out of the room for whatever embarrassment that caused for the people doing the hustling. But it's especially interesting because that was, in the case of the Uptake, because all they wanted to do was have a camera so that instead of just the people in the room, anybody on the internet could watch the event.
You want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I tend to agree with what Eric was saying, but I do think that with this sort of proliferation of different media sites, readers and consumers of news need to be aware of, is the site they're going to, do they have a particular slant on something? And it's not that that's new. There are certainly, traditional news organizations, newspapers that have had slants. They've been more conservative or liberal, but you definitely run into that all over the place on the web. So I think you can consider those reporters real journalists, but as a reader of them, you have to be aware that you might be getting a one-sided tape.
And another thing you mentioned too was this interactivity with the readers. Do you think that, sometimes I know MinnPost does a very good job of making sure the comments are positive and they're not mean-spirited. In other sites, that may not be the case. And so do you think that interactivity has somewhat of a chilling effect, whether or not the sources will be willing to talk? Because I think that they might get blasted by the general public. I mean, is there a downside to all of that interactivity?
Yeah, there is. I mean, on balance, it's a good thing. Is that our feedback?
No, it's a golf cart.
Okay. There is a downside to it, and you've pretty much alluded to it. Comment threads in some places on the internet get very ugly, and even though we have, freedom of expression in our country, I don't think it's a good thing when we create a new way for people to call each other names. And there are things that can be done about it, and MinnPost, I think, is we take some grief in the internet-oriented world for requiring commenters to use their real names and stay reasonably civil. On balance, I think that's the right place to be, but there are people who think that has some kind of a chilling effect. I disagree. But yes, of course, that is one downside, is that, and I wanted to follow up on something Cynthia said to make one slight additional point. As I already said, I think almost everything about news on the internet is better for the journalists and better for the readers. But with a proliferation of sites, many of which are very partisan and ideological. I am a little concerned that it makes it easier for people to only look at facts and viewpoints that they know in advance they'll agree with. This is a big deal to me personally. I don't know if it is to everybody, but I think it's just really important that people try to get their minds open to listening to facts and arguments that come from the side that they're not on, and see if they can open their mind for common ground. And I don't think that an audience that is decided, you know, I'm a lefty, I'm only going to read lefty sites, I'm a righty, I'm only going to watch the news from Fox because everybody else is unfriendly to me. I don't think that's really a step forward. But really, that's not a problem of the journalist. That's, in some sense, a problem of human nature. People have to overcome that desire to want to just have their pre-existing opinions constantly reconfirmed.
Okay, great. Do we have any questions from the audience about how the internet is affecting journalism and politics, covering politics? You do have a question. Go ahead.
I do. Hi. I have a two-part question, actually. The first
Mic a little closer to your mouth.
Okay. Is this better? All right. My two-part question is, a lot of older politicians have talked about the fact that the ability to get from Washington to their home district so easily has really affected the way that they're expected to fundraise and things like that. And so they're constantly fundraising more so than perhaps they were 20 years ago, which has affected the way that they interact with other Congress people and senators, because instead of just sort of being part of the club of the Senate in particular, they have to go home every weekend to raise money. And so the first part of my question is whether the internet is going to make that even more so people are even more sort of isolated into their own, I guess, constituency without a broader view. And then the second part of the question is, it seems lately that politicians have had an exponential increase in their communication with people. So all these politicians have Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds, and is there any hope that there will be a backlash against that, and we don't have to hear everything that every politician ever does in a day?
I can answer that, or talk to the second part of your question, because I know this speaks a little bit to how the internet has changed what political journalists do and what they have to cover, is that now, as a political journalist, you have to be cognizant of what, you know, the representatives or senators or whoever you're covering are putting out on the web. So you have to go check their blogs, you have to sign up for their Twitter feeds, you have to, you know, be aware of that. And I mean, I think it would be bad if that sort of was all that remained of information coming out of Washington, a blog or a Twitter feed from a politician, but I don't necessarily think those formats are bad. I mean, you can choose to go to your representative's blog if you want to, and it's another way for them to communicate with their constituents and the public. So I kind of like that added information being out there, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, one, I'll just mention that Representative Keith Ellison's in the audience, is going to be up on stage in a minute, and he's Twittering. And you might want to ask him for his view and how, you know, I'm sure that members of Congress are all talking to each other about how to interact with these new social media. You seem to feel assaulted by too much communication, but I would just suggest you don't have to read anything you don't want to read. So you have a lot of control over it. Maybe it's that you don't want them wasting their time doing it. I don't know. It's pretty hard in our society to make any kind of to expect a good reception for any kind of an argument for less communication, less openness, even if it does seem very contrived as it does. And obviously, the basic nature of those kind of communications are self-promotion. It's another point, I guess, and a good one for our previous original topic about how the internet and other new media are affecting things. It used to be a lot harder for politicians or candidates during a campaign or members of elected officials to get around the news media and communicate directly with their constituents. They were more dependent on the big newspapers if they wanted their views to be known to the public, because they didn't, they had franking privileges and could send letters, but that's a pretty limited, an important but limited means. But now it also, in some ways, I suppose you could say it reduces the role of the journalist, because if you don't like the way you're being treated by the media, just go around them, get your message directly to people. I guess that's a little concerning to me as a journalist, but not really, because it's always going to be our job to find a way to give people information that they're not getting from any other source.
Great, Eric. Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? All right. Can we have a round of applause for Eric Black and Cynthia Dizikes, Washington correspondent for MinnPost, and Eric Black. Okay.